name is Tommy Prud'homme. I'm the pastor here at Salado United Methodist Church. We're a church where everyone is welcome, where we seek on a daily basis to grow deeper into the love of God and one another, and where we reach out to our community and the world around us to share that love. I'm so glad you're here with us today, and I hope through this time with us that you will get to experience a little bit of God's love for yourself.
My name is Donna Owens Mitchell, and since we're going to talk about love today, I just have a little something I want to share with you before I read. When our Tommy was a brand new pastor here, he made a point to go around and visit everyone and introduce himself. And during the course of his visit to my husband Mike and me, one thing that he said was, "What more can you do to show Jesus' love?" And I don't remember the context that came up in, if he was talking about his own self or something that we should do, but it resonated in my heart. And since then, I started singing in the choir and became a volunteer reader. So I just want to throw that out there. What more can you do to show Jesus your love? Okay, so Matthew 22:34 through 40 in the NRSV. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" he said to him. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you very much, Donna. I'm really tempted to just sit down and say what she said. I don't know how you follow that, um, but I'm going to give it a shot. So the Pharisees, they were desperate. I mean, this guy clearly represented a threat. People were calling him a prophet. Some people were calling him the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Some people were even saying that he was a son of God. It was reported that he was even claiming the authority to forgive sins. And certainly his teaching was revolutionary. He was teaching that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. He was teaching that it's harder for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. This is dangerous stuff he's preaching there. And then he's preaching that suffering and poverty aren't necessarily a punishment from God for sin, but instead that God has a soft part in his heart where he feels for the downtrodden and the poor. Now they would love to have been able to just characterize him, call him another one of those crackpot revolutionaries. But they really couldn't, because there was something different about him. I mean, some of these same Pharisees had actually witnessed him heal a person who was paralyzed, had actually witnessed him heal a man whose hand was all withered up. They'd heard that he had healed lepers, that he had restored sight to the blind, that he'd even brought people back from the dead. And so, of course, he had started to collect a little bit of a following. Now, at first, it was just uh, really kind of a pitiful group of misfits. And in fact, he had spectacularly bad judgment in the disciples that he chose. Right, rather than gathering around him all of the scholars and all of the students, he picked a bunch of fishermen. Fishermen. And not only that, he picked a zealot, a violently anti-Roman zealot at the same time that he's picking a tax collector, a Roman collaborator. It's a miracle these guys didn't kill each other. And then as he continued to preach and as he continued to perform these miracles, the crowd started to grow, but under no circumstances could they be considered a threat. Could they be considered a revolutionary army or something? It was basically a bunch of peasants, a bunch of people who were sick, looking to be healed, a bunch of people who were lost, looking to be taught. Which is what made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem just a few days earlier so confusing to these Pharisees, because there were huge crowds of people lining the road, laying down their cloaks, waving palm branches, welcoming him into town as if he really was the Messiah, as if he really was the coming king. Now, some of the Pharisees at this point still were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he clearly had charm, he clearly had charisma. They couldn't deny the miracles, and he just didn't seem all that dangerous. But then he walked into the temple, turned over the tables of the money changers, and set all the sacrificial animals free. Basically, he declared war on the priests who ran that temple sacrificial system. Now, some of the Pharisees at this point were sort of secretly elated. They wouldn't say so, but they hated the priests. And it was about time that someone called them out for being Roman collaborators and for using the system that they had created to line their own pockets at the expense of their people. But the Pharisees also realized, I mean, they'd created their system of laws. They had scoured what we consider to be the Old Testament to find all of the commandments, all of the rules in there, and they had come up with 613 of them. 613 rules that they expected everyone to be able to live by, but that no normal person really could. It was just too much. But they were okay with that because through this system that they'd created, they had achieved a certain amount of power, a certain amount of prestige among the people, and they'd kind of grown accustomed to that. So they were okay with that. And so they realized that not only was Jesus a threat to the priests, but he might also be a threat to them. And so they did what prior to this may have actually been unthinkable. They teamed up with their arch enemies, the priests. The Pharisees and the priests got together and they decided that they were going to try and discredit Jesus with the people. They were going to try and bring him down a peg or two during that Passover when everyone was in town. And they were doing so for several reasons. First, they were concerned about the Romans, legitimately concerned about the Romans, because everybody, including the Romans, knew that this time of year at Passover, when all of these people from all over the world are crammed into Jerusalem, and you've got all this nationalistic sentiment going on, that it was a powder keg just waiting to go off. And they were worried that if Jesus lit the fuse, whatever he did, it was going to be bad. It was going to be bad for the priests, it's going to be bad for the Pharisees, it's going to be bad for all of the people, including Jesus' followers. But they were also doing it because he was a threat. He was a threat to their authority through the titles that people were giving him, through his teaching, through the authority he's claiming for himself. He was a threat. But really, maybe the deep down root reason that they did it was because he held up a mirror to them. His ministry of love, his ministry to the poor, to the outcast, held up a mirror to their hypocrisy, and they couldn't take it. They had a choice. They could change, or they could get rid of the mirror. And they chose option B. And so that week after Jesus' triumphal entry, they got together with the priests and they did everything they could to try and discredit Jesus, to try and bring him down a few pegs. They started out by just challenging his authority. What authority do you have to be doing these things that you're doing, to be saying these things that you're saying? Then they tried to engage him to stake out a position on the controversial issues of the day, things like whether to pay Roman taxes or theologically, what about resurrection? But Jesus kind of swatted these things aside as if they weren't even there. He was so effective at getting rid of these, at avoiding these traps that they tried to set for him, that the priests just finally gave up. But the Pharisees, they had one last thing, that one last hope of of snaring Jesus. And so they tested his biblical literacy, his understanding of the Bible. Imagine that, testing Jesus's biblical literacy. Because see, they'd identified all of these rules, 613 of them, and they thought, well, maybe he won't know all of them, or maybe any whatever we ask him the question, what's the greatest of all of these 613 laws? He's going to have to come up with an answer. He's going to have to identify one as the greatest, and then we can get him engaged in argument. Then we can get him distracted, which is what was so infuriating about Jesus' response, because he didn't answer the question they asked. They asked him, what's the, of all these 613, what's number one? And instead, he gave them a summary of all 613. Said, really, when you take all of those rules, you can boil them down to two: love God, love people. Love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. Jesus was saying to those Pharisees and all the people who were listening, following God isn't about memorizing and observing 613 rules. In fact, when you get down to the deepest level, it's not even about how you behave at all. It's about whether you love. I mean, how do you argue with that? Well, the Pharisees couldn't, or at least they wouldn't, not right then and there in front of the people. So they joined the priests and gave up. Now, it would have been one thing. They would have loved it if they could have called Jesus out for a little bit of hypocrisy, right? For preaching about love while secretly stealing candy from babies. But they couldn't. I mean, all you had to do was look at his life. Look at how he lived his life to see that they couldn't. I mean, he wasn't establishing for himself some sort of major theoretical or intellectual movement there in the heart of Judaism in Jerusalem by drawing together all of the best scholars and students. Instead, he's up in God-forsaken Galilee preaching to a bunch of fishermen and peasants. And even up in Galilee, he wasn't creating this comfortable situation for himself. He was by all appearances, he was itinerant. He was going from village to village. And he wasn't serving the rich and powerful, he was serving the peasants and the fishermen. He was teaching people, he was healing people, these people who could not possibly pay him back even if he had wanted them to. He lived a life of love, he lived a life of service, and as the Pharisees were about to find out in just a few days, his love went to the point of actually giving himself, giving his life for his people. He lived God's love. And here he was giving them these two rules that boil down to one. It's all about love. So Jesus here, he's presenting these Pharisees with a choice. They can't deny the miracles, and now they really can't deny his teaching. Because deep down, whether they want to admit it to themselves or not, they know that he's right. They know that it does boil down to love. On the other hand, if they follow him, they've got to give up. the power and the prestige and the acclaim and the control that they've developed. I mean, they created this system of following the rules in the hope that maybe they could avoid having to live that law of love. They thought by following these rules, maybe they can follow the rules and accumulate the power and the control and still serve God. But Jesus says to them here, it doesn't work like that. Just love. Just love. See, they thought they had trapped Jesus, but it turns out that Jesus had trapped them. He trapped them into making a choice. Continue to follow the power, continue to follow the control, or follow Jesus. To continue blindly following the rules, or to ask themselves the question, what would Jesus do? Well, we know how they decided, right? A few days later, Jesus is dead. So the real question is, how will you choose? What would Jesus choose?